Good afternoon to all my fellow scholars in Toronto, or perhaps bonjour. I'd like to say that I'm very honoured to be able to deliver this keynote presentation to members of the Serial Recycling Project and anyone else in the audience, any other scholars who were there just out of interest. So my paper is entitled Reboot Culture, Definitions, Discourses and Distinctions. I will caution you that I have a nice cup of coffee next to me to ensure that my mouth doesn't go dry, so I hope you don't mind that. Okay, so over the past decade and a half or so, I would say, the term reboot has become one of the most misunderstood and misused concepts in trade, press, and academic discourse. In essence, what we've seen is the formation of a buzzword. We might even describe it as a fuzzword, given the semantic confusion over what constitutes a reboot. So what I want to do in this paper is drill down into what the reboot concept means in relation to serial narratives, which is what immediately distinguishes the reboot from the remake. The fact that what we're talking about here is essentially a serial recycling paradigm, but we should come on to that in a while. Ultimately, this paper aims to cut through the buzz and the fuzz of mainstream discourse by taking a historical, discursive approach to the concept, which is that's what I did with my PhD on the topic, and now a monograph that I'm writing at present titled Reboot Culture, Comics, Film and Transmedia, which will be published by Palgrave Macmillan next year. So when I started research on the subject in 2009, which actually formed the basis of my undergraduate thesis, then went on to become my first peer-reviewed publication, and then became my PhD project, because I recognised that I'd barely scratched the surface of what I mistakenly believed at that point was a post-millennial phenomenon. I thought that my PhD would focus on film reboots, from Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins and through to Abrams' Star Trek from 2009, which may or may not be a reboot dependent upon the position of the audience and perhaps even one's fan status. However, once I got into the mud of research, I discovered that the reboot concept had a lengthier cultural vintage and allowed me to chart the history of the term as it emerged from superhero comics, and then to map that onto the cinematic variations and discourses that pulled the concept into the mainstream around 2005. But let's begin media res, as they say. Let's begin with bat nipples, cod pieces, and yes, George Clooney and Joel Schumacher. Let's begin with franchise wrecker Batman and Robin. And as you can see from this image here, with the bat nipple central, this photograph was taken from a fan site talking about how Joel Schumacher effectively murdered Batman. But let's go back 20 years. In 1997, the release of Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin attracted a storm of criticism from critics and fan audiences, resulting in an online and often hostile backlash that effectively transformed Warner Brothers' cast-generated winged rodent into firmly splattered roadkill. In essence, the critical response to the film forced studio chiefs back to the drawing board in order to rethink how they could repair the franchise after Schumacher's folly. We might lose sight of what the affordances of the new media and digital environment have provided for fans and entertainment critics during that period, but remember, this was one of the first instances of a fan base warming up their vocal cords in online territories, well in advance of the introduction of social media platforms, and even before the inception of those broadband speeds and fibre optic channels that we've become so used to. So there's a picture of George Clooney, Alicia Silverstone and Chris O'Donnell in their bat regalia, which, as we can see, is let's not mince words. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. But not as bad as the film itself, some might say. So Liam Burke contextualizes it this way. Warner Brothers marketing chief Chris Pooler saw one fan as a major threat, saying that one guy on the internet could start enough of a stir that causes the reactionary shift in the whole marketing program. Like Burton before him, Schumacher dismissed fans as a cult, with Entertainment Weekly reporting that he blamed negative pre-release buzz on an unpoliced internet. And of course, since that time, we have seen how unpoliced the internet can be, with the rise of what we might call toxic fandom, which I've spoken about elsewhere. Whereas in pre-digital times, Batman and Robin may have been forgotten by the wider world, fans ensured that the film's infamy would echo through cyberspace. In his first study of the character, Batman Unmasked, Analysing a Cultural Icon, published in 1999, only 2 years after Batman and Robin, Will Brooker captured the fan backlash in microcosm. So I'd like to show an example of the kind of sentiment marshalled by Bat fans during the period, with apologies to all regarding the colourful language. Schumacher, you little pissant. I don't know what the fuck you were thinking. Pick up a Batman comic, you asinine fool. Does Gotham City look like Club Expo to you? Do you see any neon? What the fuck? And nipples? This isn't a fucking joke. Batman isn't some 2-bit circus freak like your bearded lady of a mother. He is the essence of gothic darkness, a man ripped between insanity with only his partner and his butler and his mission to keep from going crazy. So like I said, quite colourful, quite hostile in a sense. You can almost feel the excoriation dripping from every word. Here we can see what Andy Medhurst described as a bat platonic ideal of what Batman should be. Resolutely not the camp crusader of the 1960s TV series, but the Dark Knight of Gotham. A man so traumatised by the death of his parents that he figured the best therapy would be to dress up like a bat and fight crime from the shadows. And if anyone in Toronto at the moment was thinking, maybe I've had some traumas in my life, I think I should dress up like a bat, I would really recommend seeing a psychologist before doing so, because clearly you would be as mad as a hatter. In adaptation terms, we could easily see this as a fanish version of fidelity criticism. The character of Batman is often split into a binary by fan audiences, between light-hearted camp and deadpan sincerity, between silly and serious, between homosexuality and heterosexuality, between good and bad objects. What Matt Hills describes as a moral dualism, a cultural value system that is created and sustained by said binary camps of good and bad. Indeed, since at least the 50s, the correct version of the character, correct in scare quotes, has often been viewed more akin to this Dark Knight, and brand owners DC Comics, itself a subsidiary of Warner Brothers, have at different historical moments conducted a strategy of containment in discursive terms. Andy Medhurst describes discourses that aim to recoup the image of Batman in line with the more serious, grim and gritty spin on the character as, and I quote, the painstaking re-heterosexualization of Batman. I can't go into the history of the character today, but briefly, it was the accusations of psychologist Frederick Wortham in the 1950s, contained within his famous book, Seduction of the Innocent, that arguably first sparked this re-heterosexualization discourse to counter claims that Batman comics were ideologically gay. And naturally, at the time, that was thought to function as a moral sledgehammer that could convince children that gay is okay. And that was a real anxiety for the moral campaigners. We can see a similar discourse around Schumacher's Batman and Robin. However, it's also important to note that contrary to popular belief, Batman and Robin did indeed make a profit at the box office, although admittedly not enough to say at executive fat cats at Warner's in comparison with other entries in the series, although the law of diminishing returns could be an explanation as well. But once sales of the many merchandised objects were factored in, it accumulated an attractive figure, I would argue. In the main, it was the critical blast radius that played at least some part in shipwrecking what had been both a box office monster and a blueprint for franchise cinema in what Alison McMahon terms the post-Hollywood era of media conglomeration and synergy. Given that the Batman franchise was Warner Brothers' only franchise in operation at the time, meant that the studio was commercially faltering. So as we can see here, we see this box set that's available in most Western countries, where the Batman series from Tim Burton's in 1989 to Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin in 1997 are kind of bound within a single series. So the budget of Batman and Robin was $125 million, and the box office was $238.2 million. So we can see almost double in profit. However, once we start to include merchandising, which took in $160 million, then the picture starts to shift. Batman and Robin took in a global overall haul, including the merchandising elements, of $398.2 million. So that's quite a hefty figure. I bet many of us here would like maybe half of that, maybe just 1 million of it in our bank accounts. But for Time Warner, this was seen as a catastrophe. But of course, we also have to say that this doesn't include DVD sales, which, as John Caldwell, Tino Ballio and Stuart Henderson have pointed out, attract much more revenue than box office receipts. Although I will admit that in the last few years, with streaming taking off across the world, your Netflix, your Now TV, your HBO, etc., that this will need readjusting with some urgency, I think, as DVD sales are plummeting at the moment. Although the film series was ostensibly in cultural purgatory for almost a decade, there were several attempts to repair the damage done by Batman and Robin, including, I'll show you some examples now. We have Joel Schumacher's third film and the fifth in the series, Batman Triumphant, which has also been called Batman Unchained, depending upon the source, starring Jeff Goldblum or Nicolas Cage as the Scarecrow, starring Madonna as Harley Quinn, and the return of Chris O'Donnell, Alicia Silverstone and George Clooney as Robin, Batgirl and Batman respectively. However, in the days in the days and weeks following the torpedoing of Batman and Robin, Joel Schumacher's next entry, which was supposed to be darker, more gritty, was cancelled. There was also supposed to be a much touted film adaptation of animated TV series Batman Beyond, featuring a veteran Bruce Wayne mentoring a younger, darker Knight of the future, Terry McGinnis. Wolfgang Petersen's Batman vs. Superman, which even had a release date circulated in the trade press of 2004. Of course, Batman and Robin, Batman vs. Superman, has since come out, directed by Zack Snyder. I think the little said about that at this moment, the better. But of course, Darren Aronofsky had this very strange idea to adapt Frank Miller's Year One, a seminal origin story of Batman, no longer canon, by the way, and perhaps starring Clint Eastwood as a veteran Batman once again. So this idea of Batman at an older stage of his career is kind of the strategy that was taken with Batman vs. Superman in the Justice League movie, which seems to be Warner Brothers' way of trying to catch up with the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, more rapidly than perhaps that studio did. Remember, during this period, Batman comics were still published regularly, but the film series had become inactive. But as we can see, not for lack of trying. Enter Christopher Nolan. And I'm just going to take a little drink here. Grabbing the reins of opportunity, Nolan pitched a darker, more plausible, let's not say realistic, Batman to studio heads, citing Richard Donner's Superman the movie as creative inspiration and template. Said Nolan, "What I felt is that I'd never seen the film of Batman that I figured someone would have done back in 1978 to 79, after Dick Donner had made that great Superman film. They'd never shown you how Bruce Wayne becomes Batman. That was the story that I wanted to see on an epic scale." And this idea of becoming is central to what we could call the continuity reboot. This aspect of the reboot of origins and becoming is central to Batman Begins, and for other reboots as well, including the becoming Bond film Casino Royale, and the origin story of Captain James T. Kirk and the Enterprise crew in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek from 2009. Nolan explained that Batman Begins should not be read as a follow-up to Schumacher's Batman and Robin. "I don't see this as either a prequel or sequel to the other films. It just sort of exists in its very own universe." Where was the term reboot first applied to Batman Begins then? Here's where it gets quite interesting. Following the completion of the Dark Knight trilogy in 2012, with The Dark Knight Rises bookending the series, Nolan emphasised in an interview that the concept of rebooting didn't exist when they were producing Batman Begins. It's a sign of how quickly things change in the movie business. There was no such thing as a reboot, conceptually speaking. That's new terminology, and I put that in bold for a reason. In another interview, I don't even know who was first banging around the term reboot or whatever, but it was after Batman Begins, so we didn't have any kind of reference for that idea of kind of resetting a franchise. Of course, Nolan is incorrect on this, and demonstrates why discursive utterances should not be so readily accepted as true by scholars before checking the validity of such statements, which is what Konstantin Verivas did in his chapter on what he calls new millennial remakes. Let's have a look at what Verivas says. This is the beginning of the article. This is how it begins. When asked in a recent interview what appealed to him about rebooting a series that had already been interpreted, Christopher Nolan replied that when he undertook Batman Begins, the first installment in Warner Bros.' The Dark Knight trilogy, there was no such thing conceptually as a reboot. That idea didn't exist. Verivas' chapter takes Nolan's comment as a starting point for a preliminary investigation of the state of cinematic remaking in the first decades of the new millennium. This should also caution scholars against staying firmly within a single disciplinary framework. Verivas is a film studies scholar. He's a fantastic film studies scholar. His book on film remakes is kind of seminal at this point. But not moving outside the borders of cinema and film studies means that he begins his analysis from a faulty premise, I would argue. He begins by quoting Nolan and states that he is using this as his, and I quote, starting point. Even as a starting point for cinema, this is quite problematic, as Nolan is, to put it frankly, very wrong about this. In fact, perhaps Nolan should already be aware that it was his co-writer and collaborator on Batman Begins and its sequels that was first banging around the term reboot or whatever in promotional rounds before the film's theatrical release in 2005, certainly not after Batman Begins, as Nolan claims, and as we shall see, it is in no way new terminology. So David S. Goyer is Nolan's co-writer on Batman Begins and the rest of the films in the series, and Nolan reached out for him because of his expertise in the character. He previously wrote for DC Comics, and David S. Goyer said, after Batman and Robin, it was necessary to do what we call, in comic book terms, a reboot. Say you've had 187 issues of The Incredible Hulk, and you decide you're going to introduce a new issue 1. You pretend like those first 187 issues never happened, and you start the story from the beginning, and the slate is wiped clean, and no one blinks. So we did the cinematic equivalent of a reboot, and by doing that, setting it at the beginning, you've instantly distanced yourself from anything that's come before. Excuse me. In fairness to Konstantin Verivas, there is at least some accuracy to Nolan's claims. Batman Begins is almost certainly the first film to be described as a reboot in discourse. Yet, at the same time as Goyer announces, the concept has a cultural ancestry. But before we jump into the DeLorean and accelerate to 88 miles per hour, let's take a moment to examine Goyer's comment. So then, the notion of rebooting involves disavowing an already existing narrative sequence in order to wipe the slate clean and begin again. It is always a beginning again. It should really be Batman Begins again, as Nolan's film is not the first time the origin story is being told, although it is partly the first time it is being told in this way. In addition, as we can see from Goyer's account, Batman and Robin is not excommunicated at all, but is pulled into closer view in order to construct a binary by activating a distinction between Schumacher's bad bat object and Nolan's good bad object. So these good and bad objects, the good and bad are always in scare quotes because these are discursive features. As Will Blucher explains, Promotional scripts or paratexts of this sort only partially attempt to wipe Schumacher's Batman from the slate, because this trace of an alternative previous interpretation was also needed to give Nolan's film its definition. To demonstrate the novelty and value of a new approach, the producers had to retain some contrasting traces of the bad old one in the production discourses, and rather than erasing it, they in fact made the bad object visible again as a point of comparison. Wiping the slate clean is of course impossible, but I would argue that Brooker is taking the metaphor of rebooting far too literally here. It is a metaphor after all. A reboot aims to reset the narrative back to the beginning, but as already stated, it is always a beginning again. The slate is a palimpsest containing all the traces and shapes of previous iterations of the Batman character, produced and deployed across multiple media since 1939, almost 80 years at this point. On the other hand, however, Goya's paratextual rhetoric offers instructions on how to approach Batman Begins and what reading strategies should be activated. Firstly, it is not Batman and Robin. Jonathan Gray puts it this way: the tale of Batman Begins is one of how to escape a dark shadow. Audience and critical reception of Batman and Robin had been so near universally caustic that it had set up a strong paratextual perimeter and a flaming hoop through which any subsequent Batman text would need to pass. Batman Begins and Time Warner needed to apologise for Batman and Robin, only to erase any semblance of an intertextual connection. Only Batman himself could remain, albeit radically reconfigured. Secondly, it's clear that the process of rebooting was not only activated in the narrative of the film itself, but in the paratext that surrounded the film prior to its theatrical release. Brooker astutely asks in Hunting the Dark Knight, when did Batman Begins begin? It is worth keeping that in mind when discussing the way in which texts of this sort are framed in advance of the primary cinematic text being released to the public. What I want to do next is show the distinctions between these different, what I term, strategies of regeneration. This includes distinguishing between reboots, remakes, sequels, prequels, and other serial concepts. I see in Mark Wolf's book on imaginary worlds, has a glossary at the back and talks about interquels, intraquels, paraquels, and all of that jazz. So the mobilisation of retroactive continuity, or in Spanish terms retconning, is also another way that we can distinguish between these serial concepts, and also relaunching. In this way, I want to provide a working definition of the reboot process. So since Nolan's reboot, the term has swiftly become one of the most misunderstood in popular entertainment discourse, and academic discourse actually. And as Joe Tompkins has argued, rebooting is not only a narrative strategy, but it is also a discourse. But this has, I would argue, led to the formation of the term reboot as a buzzword, as I said at the beginning. So let's cut through the buzz and fuzz. First, what exactly is a reboot? Where does the term come from? Let's look at the etymology of the word, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, comes from computer terminology. So in computer terms, a reboot refers to a process that involves shutting down a computer system in order to reset the central processing unit, or CPU, and then restarting it, most often to recover a system from failure, as Tucker calls it, or describes it, sorry. It's a malfunction in a sense. I'm sure we've all had similar issues at work where our computer's just having a bad day, so we phone up systems or someone who can help, and we're told to log off and log back on. That seems to be the expertise of the systems department in many places. Tucker goes on, before a retry is performed, the system must restart from some correct state. One solution is to initialize the entire system by rebooting it. So in essence, rebooting the Batman franchise system must restart from some correct state. And that state is arguably where Batman is in this state of becoming, in this state of beginning again. The Oxford English Dictionary, or the OED for short, claims that the origin for the term comes in 1971 in computers, although Webster's puts it a decade later in 2001. Then in 1989, as a metaphor attributed to Toronto's The Globe and Mail. How very strange. Who printed that? Sorry. Computer retailer Canada Lease is still hoping to reboot its operation. So we can see 1989, the term being used outside of computers, but with that metaphor, with that analogy still in mind. And in 2006, as a narrative process, as beginning again. However, we have already seen that Goya used the term in 2005, so the OED is simply wrong, much like Nolan's 2012 comments quoted earlier. As an aside, I have contacted the OED on multiple occasions to redress this, offering documented evidence, and I've yet to receive a response. I certainly don't expect one at this point, as I last sent a communique in 2014. As Goya commented that rebooting originates in comics, I aim to find examples of the word in use within the comic book territory. Firstly, however, even the first academic use of the term is well before OED's 2006 origin point. I did find myself growing quite frustrated about this. I won't pretend otherwise. So what we have is kind of an academic chapter in the journal Serials Review by Jane K. Griffin, which really is a brief glossary of comic book terminology as the title signals. Griffin says, a reboot typically occurs when a character's history has become too complex and self-contradictorily that when a publisher strives to bolster a faltering line by starting from scratch, when a publisher strives to bolster a faltering line by starting from scratch. A year earlier, in the same journal, Joel Hale uses the term reboot to describe DC's seminal event series, Crisis on Infinite Earths from 1986. What is interesting in relation to Crisis is that during the period, the event series was not described as a reboot in promotional items or trade presses. So we can reasonably assume that the term was not in discursive operation in the mid-80s, although I would be more than happy if anyone else could provide counter-evidence to that. So Crisis on Infinite Earths, often heralded as the grandfather of reboots, as Ross Cavaney describes it, is this massive 12-issue event series which wipes the slate clean of all of these confusing and contradictory instantiations that had become part of the massive DC universe. And you know, the DC comic book universe is larger in scope than probably any serial text in history. It's that vast. In fact, Ross Cavaney argues that it's larger than the Greek myths of old. But I don't think Crisis is exactly a reboot. It's bound up in a process of revisionism, and this takes place within the story itself. So what happens in the story is the big bad of the event, the Anti-Monitor, is destroying the universe. So it becomes part of the story, and that's kind of what happens in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek as well. But I would say that the true reboots come after the series which collapsed the DC universe from a multiverse, that is, a nexus of parallel worlds, into one single coherent story world. This allowed for the rebooting of several characters, especially Superman in John Byrne's Man of Steel, which is no longer canon today. Neither is George Perez's Wonder Woman. However, this wide-scale reboot operation was not as clean as architect of the project Marv Wolfman wanted, and again, DC was confronted with many continuity issues, as characters remembered events and episodes that should not be in the rebooted timeline. In many ways, this is one of the reasons why DC Comics continues to reboot every few years, to recalibrate the universe towards coherence, and also, between you and I, to make lots of money. DC have largely been unsuccessful on this front, so I describe Crisis on Infinite Earths not as a reboot, but as a pre-boot, kind of a prequel to the reboot. If rebooting wipes the slate clean so new readers can jump on board without needing to know at this point 50 years of history, then Crisis is for old-time readers only, what Douglas Walt calls super readers, these people who have aging yellow comic boxes in their possession with thousands of issues, etc. Any new reader at the time in 1986 would be completely lost, I would say, trying to comprehend the story related in Crisis, as it demanded an advanced intertextual competence that a new reader would not possess. And of course, comic book fans, as Henry Jenkins have said, continuity is the bread and butter of their immersion. And they often argue and debate these things with themselves to kind of display their own cultural capital. But the earliest example of published use I've found is from 1996 on the DC Usenet message board under frequently asked questions. Here's an image of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and as we can see, all of these, the kind of train of Earths you can see is what they were trying to dismantle to make the universe more accessible to new readers. What we do need to see, in the economic context of the time, DC were losing out to Marvel massively in the 80s, and they needed to do something in order to challenge their loss of market share. Here's John Byrne's Man of Steel and George Perez's Wonder Woman, neither of which are canon any longer. Okay, so the DC Usenet message board in 1996 had, as a frequently asked question, what is a reboot? And DC answered with, a reboot is the complete remaking of a character's or title's continuity. As we can clearly see, the reboot principle is not new terminology at all, with evidence that the term was in operation to refer to a wiping the slate clean of serial continuity and beginning again in a new narrative location in 1996. Since Goya's comment, and more importantly, since Batman Begins signalled to media producers that one could simply hit the reboot button and begin again if a franchise object was under threat or needed a sharp kick up the backside. The term entered the mainstream and began to be invoked in multiple contradictory ways, leading to semantic confusion and the formation of a discursive buzzword. Here are a few examples of the term being used after 2005 and beyond narrative genres and media. I need to take a drink, sorry people. I can only scratch the surface of what can be seen as a semantic explosion and a significant rise in everyday uses of the term in cultural and lexical ways. So let's look at a few examples that are not related to films, etc. Bill Gates is rebooting the toilet. 10 tricks to reboot your brain. Feel sharper, concentrate better, and stop brain fog with these smart moves. We have Manchester United planning a defensive reboot in February 2018. 10 tips to reboot your sex life. As we age, our libidos plummet. Well, I don't know what to say. But the good news is there's plenty you can do to get the mercury soaring again in the bedroom. Jane Worthington offers 10 ways to reignite the cooling embers of sexual desire. Can Obama reboot? Does he even want to? Theresa May's cabinet reboot descends into chaos. Reboot development, 2018. Joe Cross, the reboot with George, the reboot juice diet with Joe. This is to reboot your system so you can get off all that pesky medication. Reboot your business. Das Reboot, how German football reinvented itself and conquered the world. Reboot your career. Reboot your marriage. Reboot your reputation. Reboot. There are many, 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 many more examples that I could have used. But what's interesting is that the majority of these examples come after 2005. Now, I'm not trying to argue that it was Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins that kicked the term into the mainstream in a linear sense, but seemed to be drawing upon all these ideas of remakes, regeneration. There's a book about the retro music scene. Retromania, that's what it's called. Sorry, my brain went dead there for a moment. So perhaps you've read Dick Hebdige's review of the term postmodernism in the past, but if not, here's a quote. Hebdige says, "When it becomes possible for people to describe as postmodern the decor of a room, the design of a building, the diegesis of a film, the construction of a record or a scratch video, a television commercial or an arts documentary, or the intertextual relations between them, then it's clear we are in the presence of a buzzword." Here's a paraphrase of that. When it becomes possible for people to describe a reboot as a prequel, a sequel, a remake, a book, or when one can reboot a toilet, a cabinet, a presidency, a brain, a career, a sex life, a marriage, a business, then it's clear we are in the presence of a buzzword. Okay, so the discourse mushroomed exponentially as entertainment critics began evoking the term to describe a range of cultural objects, often in contradictory and I would say erroneous ways. This has now unfortunately spread into the academy, so Heather Urbanski's book, The Science Fiction Reboot, fundamentally misinterprets what constitutes a reboot, even going so far as to describe Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, as a reboot. It's a prequel. The clue is in the title, Episode 1. Astonishingly, Urbanski doesn't define what a reboot is, but we can gauge the way in which he thinks about reboots from this quote. Reboots have been around in many different types for quite literally centuries. Reboots or reimaginings are in many ways nothing new to popular culture. Well-known examples include the many remakes of the Arthurian legends, A Christmas Carol, Jane Austen novels, Shakespeare's plays, many of which could be considered reimaginings themselves. So what we can see here is a conflation of reboot, reimagining and remake. And while there are multiple conceptual overlaps between these paradigms, distinctions can and should be made. The term reboot has come to be marshalled in so many ways that the concept is an empty category as it has been freighted with too much meaning. And without a specific meaning, it becomes useless as an analytic category. Remakes, reimaginings, retcons, relaunches, revivals, adaptations, prequels and sequels, etc. These are all what I term strategies of regeneration. Yes, they share common principles, but distinctions need to be made between them so we can better analyse the way in which the culture industries, cutting across media platforms, regenerate cultural objects and breathe new life into them. So I want to conclude this presentation with a few examples of the way that entertainment critics and academics have misused the reboot concept. But first, what is a reboot? A reboot is a serial text that aims to wipe the slate clean of a previous narrative sequence in order to begin again from year zero and with a new continuity. One reboots a system, not a singular text, as with remakes. So here, a remake is a reinterpretation of a single text, usually a film. A reboot is a reimagining of a serial or series that possesses a continuity. It's about a system, a narrative system. The key thing to remember is that a reboot disavows, ignores, or replaces an already existing narrative sequence. Contrarily, a sequel or prequel is a text that can be appended onto an already existing narrative sequence. A reboot is a text that disavows an already existing narrative sequence. Sequels and prequels connect. Reboots disconnect. Here are a few examples of films and TV series described as reboots in press and trade discourse, but which are all serial texts, that is, not reboots at all. So, Doctor Who was relaunched in 2005 and is invariably called a reboot. The new Who is in the same continuity as old Who. There is no binary between objects except a temporal lag between series, and this is a common way that reboot is used. So if there's a space between the final installment and something and the new installment, then that is invariably called a reboot. but that is not what a reboot is. If it is, that means that every Terminator film from Terminator 2 onwards is a reboot. So this starts to muddy the conceptual water, so we find it difficult to analyse anything really without understanding where the term originated and what it means. Doctor Who was famously cancelled in 1989 and came back in 2005, so that's the kind of cultural wilderness element. Godfather 3 would be a reboot based on that, and I wouldn't expect anyone to describe that film as a reboot. As Sean Shimpak put it, New Who is not a reboot or a remake of the earlier series, nor another set of stories simply set in the same fictional universe, but instead an updated continuation of the previous programme, featuring the familiar box-shaped TARDIS, familiar antagonists, animated mannequin autons, last seen in 1971. Later, Daleks, Cybermen, Sontarans, the Master, etc., and young female companions from early 20th century Earth, especially London. This programme was the same programme, same histories, same memories, but with a new form and new traits. Doctor Who had regenerated. So I would describe Doctor Who from 2005 not as a reboot, but as a relaunch. Let's look at what fans think about Doctor Who as reboot. New Who is not a reboot. It's a continuation or a relaunch. A reboot, pretty much by definition, has a brand new continuity. Battlestar Galactica is a reboot. Batman is a reboot. The Amazing Spider-Man is a reboot. James Bond is a reboot, even though it shares one common actor with the Brosnan ones. That is not the case in Doctor Who. Eccleston, Tennant, Smith and Capaldi are playing the exact same Doctor as Hartnell, therefore Doctor Who is unambiguously not a reboot. Excuse me. Indeed, many fans query and question the use of reboot in entertainment discourse, as in the next example. Star Wars The Force Awakens is not a reboot, but again, can be best described as a relaunch. It's not called a sequel trilogy for naught. It's not called Episode 7 because it begins again, but because it continues. Fangirl Amanda Ward argues. And this is before The Force Awakens hits theatres, well in advance actually. Star Wars journalism is kicking into high gear right now, and so is my extreme annoyance with loose semantics. Star Wars has never been rebooted. It seems obvious to me none of these films are reboots, reimaginings, or remakes of any other Star Wars film, but apparently it is not that clear for others. Star Wars is now one big 9-part saga, at least when talking about the Skywalker saga. So here's some other examples drawn from press kit discourse of serial continuations, not reboots, but which have all been described as reboots. Gilmore Girls, A Year in the Life, Fuller House, Prometheus, Terminator Salvation, Terminator Genesis, 24 Live Another Day, The X-Files, Twin Peaks, DC Comics Rebirth, Superman Returns, Star Trek Discovery, Halloween, which comes out in October, Roseanne, Will and Grace. All of these are relaunches. Some things, like Terminator Salvation, are different than the preceding text in the sense that they kind of move the generic furniture somewhat, so we can describe that as a refresh if we want to keep in line with computer terminologies and metaphors. As what I call strategies of regeneration, we can differentiate between relaunch, revival and retconning, an abbreviation of retroactive continuity, which also comes from comics, but is also used across genres such as the soap opera. And I would recommend Andrew Freidenthal's book on retcons, called Retcon Game, for anyone interested. All of these texts are continuations, sequels, or relaunches. So a relaunch, a revival of a serial text following an earlier completion. This would be something like The X-Files, or Twin Peaks, or Star Wars The Force Awakens. There's been some time in the cultural wilderness. A retcon is short for retroactive continuity, whereby established facts are adjusted or revised to serve a story in the present. Although originating from again superhero comics and before the inception of rebooting as a term, retconning is used in multiple serial media, including as I said, soap operas. So if anyone remembers this from Dallas in the 1980s, where, I can't go into it now, but briefly, this character, Bobby Ewing, is killed in a car accident, and the next season, season 8, is about dealing with the loss of Bobby and then in this shift. But fan backlash was so high because Bobby Ewing was such a good character that at the end of season 8, Bobby is in the shower. Then the entirety of season 8 is said to have been a dream. The previous 31 episodes had all been a dream. It's now known as the dream season. This is the retcon par excellence. It doesn't reboot the series as the continuity remains intact, but it erases or revises some content. Another example, the UK soap opera Coronation Street has a character called Mike Baldwin, and for many years he was seen as an only child, until one day his brother knocks on the door. That is a retcon. That is retroactive continuity. So what a study of reboots can do then is teach us further how serialization, or what I would call sequentiality, operates in relation to continuity narratives, each instructing how strategies of regeneration function in popular culture, be it in comics, film, television, and so forth. The fact that many texts described as reboots have spent at least some time in cultural purgatory also tells us that sequential texts never really end, even when they say they do. They might disappear for a while, but sometimes, oftentimes, the dead come back to life. Thank you very much for listening today, everyone, and I look forward to any questions or queries you may have. I will say that this paper has only just started to scratch the surface regarding the way in which regeneration and rebirth operates in popular culture. With that in mind, you can always buy my book when it's published next year. Shameless plug. Although I'm more than happy to discuss with keen scholars via email at bproctor@bournemouth.ac.uk. One thing is certain, however, as stated in the Battlestar Galactica reboot, all this has happened before, and all of this will happen again. Thank you for listening.